So today, I want to tell you something that almost nobody in the mainstream media is saying out loud, because they cannot say it. It breaks the narrative they have been building for 6 weeks. The United States just agreed to a ceasefire with Iran. And the moment that ceasefire was announced, Iran's Supreme National Security Council released a statement. They said their military had achieved its objectives. They said the ceasefire granted Iran, and I want you to remember this exact phrase, unique economic and geopolitical standing. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi posted on X that Iran's powerful armed forces would cease defensive operations, not surrender, not concede, cease defensive operations. And then you had Iran's parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, within hours of the ceasefire taking effect, publicly accusing the United States of already violating the agreement, not asking politely, accusing, from a country that America just spent 6 weeks bombing. Now here's the thing that most people are not asking. America entered this war with 3 stated objectives: end Iran's nuclear program, destroy Iran's military capability, and create the conditions for regime change. 6 weeks later, after the biggest oil supply shock in recorded history, after deploying multiple carrier groups, after the largest American air campaign since the Iraq War, here is what America is sitting with right now. Iran's government is still standing. The Strait of Hormuz is still under Iranian control. Oil is still trading well above where it was before the war began. And Iran walked into the ceasefire negotiations with a 10-point plan that included lifting all American sanctions, withdrawing all U.S. forces from the region, and guaranteeing Iranian dominance over the Strait of Hormuz. That is not the demand list of a country that lost. That is the opening position of a country that believes it is negotiating from strength. And today, I want to walk you through exactly why that belief may be correct, step by step. Because once you understand the structure of what actually happened here, not the headlines, not the press conferences, but the underlying strategic reality, the ceasefire stops looking like a pause in an American victory. It starts looking like something far more consequential. It starts looking like the moment American power in the Middle East reached its ceiling. Let me start with what America said it was going to accomplish, because this matters enormously. In February 2026, when the United States and Israel launched the operation they called Epic Fury, the stated objectives from the Pentagon and from Trump himself were unambiguous. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said America would render Iran combat ineffective for years to come. Trump said publicly that America would hit Iran so hard it would return to the Stone Age. The objective was not just to damage Iran's nuclear program. The objective was military and political collapse, regime change. That was the explicit goal. Now fast forward to April 8, 2026. Hegseth holds a press conference and announces, quote, a historic and overwhelming victory. He says Iran has been rendered combat ineffective for years. And within the same briefing, he confirms that U.S. military forces remain, in his words, prepared to go on offensive and prepared to restart at a moment's notice. You do not say you are prepared to restart a war you already won. Let me give you the structural facts now, because this is where the analysis separates from the commentary. Structural fact number 1. America went into this war to destroy Iran's ability to threaten the region. But Iran's military never stopped firing, not for a single day of the 6-week war. Every morning during the conflict, Iran was striking American bases, Gulf state infrastructure, and Israel simultaneously. By the time the ceasefire arrived, Iran had launched over 550 ballistic missiles and roughly 1,000 drones at Israel during the 12-day war alone in June 2025. And then it fought another full war starting February 28, 2026. The IRGC was striking daily, multiple frontiers simultaneously. A country that has been rendered combat ineffective does not do that. A country that is losing does not do that. Now, yes, the nuclear facilities at Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan were struck. The Institute for the Study of War concluded that American bunker buster bombs severely degraded Iran's enrichment capability. That is real damage. No one is disputing that. But here is what you have to sit with. Within 48 hours of the ceasefire, Iran's parliament voted to suspend all cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the body responsible for monitoring Iran's nuclear activity. Iran's foreign minister signaled that Iran may withdraw entirely from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Think about what that means structurally. America went to war specifically to bring Iran's nuclear program under tighter international control. And Iran has emerged from that war with less international nuclear oversight than it had before the first bomb fell. That is not a secondary outcome. That is the opposite of the stated objective. Structural fact number 2. The Strait of Hormuz was Iran's most powerful card, and Iran still holds it. Before February 28, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz was open. About 20 million barrels of oil moved through it every single day. That is roughly 20% of the entire world's seaborne oil supply. On March 2nd, the IRGC officially confirmed the strait was closed. Iran launched 21 confirmed attacks on merchant ships. It reportedly laid sea mines. Insurance premiums for vessels attempting transit went from 0.125% of ship value to multiples of that in days. Almost all shipping traffic stopped. The International Energy Agency, all 32 member states, had to release 400 million barrels from emergency reserves just to try to slow the price spike. Dubai crude hit 166 per barrel on March 19th. That is the highest price ever recorded in history. California gasoline crossed $5 per gallon in the second week of March. The OECD projected that American inflation would rise to 4.2% in 2026, far above the 2.68% average of 2025. And here is the detail that settles this argument about who holds the leverage. The ceasefire announcement came less than 2 hours before Trump's 8 p.m. Eastern Time deadline on April 8th. Trump had threatened that, and I am quoting him directly here, a whole civilization will die tonight if Iran did not reopen the strait. That threat drew a rebuke from Pope Leo XIV. It drew condemnation from France, from Germany, from countries across Asia. And then, with less than 2 hours to go before his own deadline, Trump accepted Iran's 10-point framework as a workable basis for negotiation. Less than 2 hours. That is not the timeline of a negotiator who has won. That is the timeline of a negotiator who needed a deal. Now here is what Iran's 10-point plan actually contained. Iran demanded lifting of all American sanctions. Iran demanded withdrawal of U.S. forces from the region. Iran demanded recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran said passage through the strait during the ceasefire would be coordinated through Iran's armed forces to guarantee, their word, Iran's dominance. Iran is not reopening the strait as a concession. Iran is reopening the strait as the new landlord. A maritime security expert at IR Consilium, a maritime law consultancy, said publicly that the ceasefire leaves Iran in control of the strait and that before the war, Iran allowed ships to pass unimpeded. Now, Iran has created a new economic weapon and a new deterrence capability that did not exist before the war started. Structural fact number 3, the cost exchange destroyed America's strategic credibility in the region faster than any military loss could have. Let me give you the math because the math is devastating. Before the war, America had no U.S. military casualties from Iranian action in the region. Iran had been effectively contained. The petrodollar system was functioning. Gulf states were aligned with Washington. Now count what it cost America to get to this ceasefire. Oil at nearly 160,000 a barrel at its peak, the largest oil supply shock in recorded history. 12 to 15 million barrels of crude per day blocked from global markets. American inflation rising. A Wisconsin Supreme Court election that Republicans lost substantially, with analysts citing gas prices as a primary driver. Multiple American MQ-9 Reaper drones shot down, 16 confirmed losses over the course of the conflict. a full naval campaign to try to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which required American warships to enter waters that Iran had already mined. And after all of that, the ceasefire does not require Iran to surrender. It does not require Iran to disarm. It does not require Iran's government to step down. It requires Iran to allow ships through the strait via coordination with Iran's own military forces. The Center for Strategic and International Studies said in a published analysis this week that the ceasefire is less a resolution than a pause in a conflict whose underlying drivers remain not only intact, but in some cases intensified. They said even if the United States seeks to step back, its close alignment with Israel means it will remain exposed to Iranian retaliation, making a cycle of wars after the war difficult to escape. That is CSIS. That is the most establishment American think tank there is. Not a fringe outlet, not a sympathetic commentator, the most cautious, most credentialed foreign policy institution in Washington, telling you that this ceasefire traps America in the region, not frees it. Structural fact number 4, Iran still controls the economic weapon that matters most. The Ras Laffan industrial complex in Qatar, which handles roughly 20% of global liquefied natural gas production, sustained damage during the war that reduced its export capacity by 17%. According to Rystad Energy, the total cost of rebuilding energy infrastructure across the region could exceed $25 billion. And BCA Research's analysts wrote this week that energy and commodity markets are likely to remain on a structurally higher floor regardless of the ceasefire outcome, because governments are now hoarding and restocking in anticipation of renewed conflict. Oil prices before the war were around $70 a barrel. On April 8th, after the ceasefire announcement triggered the biggest single-day oil price drop since April 2020, Brent crude settled at $94.75, still 30% above pre-war levels, still 30% more expensive for every American driving to work, heating their home, buying groceries that were transported on trucks that run on diesel. That pain does not disappear with a ceasefire announcement. It is structural now. And then there is the dimension that almost no one in the Western press is examining carefully enough. What did this ceasefire do to America's deterrence architecture everywhere else in the world? Because that is the question that will define the next decade. When America started this war, the implicit message was clear. Cross us, defy us, build weapons that threaten our allies, and we will bring the full force of American military power down on you. Now every government on earth has watched what happened. They watched Iran take 6 weeks of American and Israeli airstrikes, the most sophisticated bombing campaign since the Iraq War. They watched Iran's government survive. They watched Iran's military keep firing every single day of those 6 weeks. And they watched the United States agree to a ceasefire on Iran's timeline, using Iran's framework, less than 2 hours before an ultimatum that Trump himself had set. Russia called the ceasefire a crushing defeat for America. And I am not quoting Russia because Russia is trustworthy or unbiased. I am quoting Russia because what Russia says publicly about this ceasefire is exactly what every foreign ministry in Beijing, in Pyongyang, in Tehran, and in capitals across the global south is calculating privately. Now let me address the argument the other side is making, because it is not nothing. The argument goes like this. Iran's nuclear facilities are rubble. Iran spent roughly half of its entire ballistic missile stockpile in the 12-day war alone. Khamenei is dead. Key commanders are gone. Key nuclear scientists were eliminated in Israeli strikes. The axis of resistance is battered. Hezbollah was hit hard in Lebanon. Hamas was devastated in Gaza. Syria is gone as an Iranian client state. Iran's economy was already collapsing from decades of sanctions, and now it has to rebuild from war damage on top of that. All of that is true, every single point. And if you believe that the goal of this war was to inflict maximum destruction on Iran, then yes, the destruction was significant. But there is a difference between inflicting damage and achieving your objectives. America did not go to war to inflict damage on Iran. America went to war to end Iran as a strategic threat. And here is what matters right now, today, on April 10th, 2026. Iran is still a strategic threat. Iran still controls the Strait of Hormuz, the single most important choke point in the global energy system. Iran still has a government that is demanding American sanctions be lifted, American forces be withdrawn, and Iranian enrichment rights be recognized. Iran just formalized with Oman a joint maritime protocol to institutionalize coordinated management of tanker traffic through the strait. Let me say that slowly. Iran is now negotiating agreements with neighboring countries to institutionalize its management of the Strait of Hormuz. Before this war, Iran had no such agreement. Before this war, Iran had no formal mechanism for controlling who moves through that waterway and when. America started this war, and Iran is ending it with more institutional control over the world's most important oil passage than it had when the shooting started. That is the strategic outcome. Now let me tell you what happens in the next 14 days, because the 2-week ceasefire is not an ending. It is the opening move of a negotiation that will define the Middle East for a generation. And the negotiation starts from a position that should concern everyone who believed America came out ahead here. Iran's 10-point plan is the opening bid. Iran knows it will not get everything on that list. Iran always knew that. The 10-point plan was designed to establish Iran's position as the party negotiating from strength, not desperation. And now look at what America actually got confirmed in the ceasefire announcement. Trump confirmed that Iran must stop uranium enrichment. That is 1 point. 1 point. Versus Iran's list that includes lifting all sanctions, withdrawing all forces, and formalizing Iranian control of the strait. That asymmetry in demands tells you exactly where each side believes the leverage sits right now. Iran's parliamentary speaker accused the United States of violating 3 elements of the ceasefire agreement within 24 hours of it taking effect. 3 separate violations alleged within 1 day: Israel's continued strikes in Lebanon, a drone entering Iranian airspace, and the denial of Iran's right to enrich uranium. Vice President J.D. Vance acknowledged the ceasefire is, his exact words, a fragile truce, not a victory, a fragile truce, and the strait is still not open. The day after the ceasefire, Iran's IRGC said shipping through the Strait of Hormuz had stopped again following Israeli strikes in Lebanon. Ship traffic has not recovered. According to data from the analytics firm Kepler, the strait is seeing somewhere between 10 and 15 vessels per day, compared to the 120 to 150 it processed before the war began. Insurance underwriters say the ceasefire is a positive development, but that risks remain, including a lack of clarity over which Iranian authority is actually in charge of approving transit for specific vessels. So here is what the next 14 days will reveal. And here's the question that will determine whether this ceasefire holds or collapses. Can America force Israel to stop striking Lebanon? Because that is the tripwire. Iran has made clear that the ceasefire applies to Lebanon. Israel has made clear it does not. Pakistan's prime minister said the ceasefire covers everywhere. Israel's prime minister's office posted that it does not cover Lebanon. J.D. Vance said it was a legitimate misunderstanding. Iran called it a violation. This is not a secondary dispute. Lebanon is the load-bearing wall of the ceasefire architecture. If Israel continues striking Hezbollah in Lebanon, which it was doing at a rate of over 100 strikes per day in the 24 hours after the ceasefire took effect, Iran will not reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And if Iran does not reopen the Strait of Hormuz, oil stays near $100 a barrel. American inflation stays elevated. The political pressure on Trump domestically grows, and the ceasefire collapses into another escalation cycle. Netanyahu has already said publicly, this ceasefire is not the end, it is a stop on the way to achieving all of our objectives, either by agreement or by resuming the fighting. An Israeli cabinet minister called the ceasefire a mistake and compared Iran to Nazi Germany. America is trapped between a negotiating partner that has already accused it of violating the agreement and an ally that is already signaling it plans to resume the war. That is not a victorious position. That is a structural trap. And let me tell you what the deepest structural problem is, because this goes beyond Iran, beyond this war, beyond this ceasefire. America entered the Middle East decades ago to guarantee the petrodollar system. to ensure that the oil that powers the global economy flows freely, is priced in dollars, and is protected by American military power. That arrangement is the foundation of the dollar's status as the global reserve currency. It is the mechanism that allows America to borrow $35 trillion at interest rates that would destroy any other country. For 50 years, that system worked because everyone in the region understood that American military power was the ultimate guarantee of free passage through the Strait of Hormuz. That guarantee was never tested directly until now. And what the test revealed is that Iran can close the Strait of Hormuz, sustain American and Israeli bombing for 6 weeks, and emerge from a ceasefire as the entity that controls transit through the strait going forward. That revelation does not disappear after this ceasefire is signed. It does not disappear if a permanent deal is eventually reached. It is now part of every government's risk calculation everywhere in the world. Every country that holds U.S. Treasury debt because they trusted the petrodollar system is now updating their model. Every Gulf state that hosted American bases because they believed American power was unconditional is now recalculating. Saudi Arabia, which has been quietly in dialogue with China for years, just watched America's closest ally and America itself fail to restore free passage through the most important waterway in Saudi Arabia's own economy. The CFR published analysis this week stating explicitly that Iran now has leverage over the Strait of Hormuz that it did not have before the war began, and that the ceasefire in some ways legitimizes Iranian control over that waterway. So let me give you my prediction. Not prophecy, not wishful thinking, structural logic. Prediction 1. This 2-week ceasefire will not produce a final deal. The gaps between what America requires and what Iran will accept are not negotiating gaps. They are strategic gaps. America says no uranium enrichment under any terms. Iran's 10-point plan says enrichment is a sovereign right. Those two positions cannot be bridged in 14 days. What the ceasefire will produce is a longer pause, another temporary arrangement, another few weeks or months of fragile non-shooting while both sides maneuver. The pattern from the 12-day war ceasefire in June 2025 to this ceasefire in April 2026 is already clear. Wars end, ceasefires get announced, both sides claim victory, and then the underlying conflict restarts because none of the structural issues have been resolved. Prediction 2. Iran will use the Strait of Hormuz as leverage in every future negotiation permanently. Before this war, Iran had a theoretical capability to close the strait. That capability was a deterrent, a threat, an option it had never fully exercised. Now, Iran has actually done it. It has demonstrated that the strait can be closed, that the global economy will seize up within weeks, that oil can reach $166 a barrel, and that the pressure this creates on American domestic politics is more powerful than American military force. That lesson is now part of the permanent strategic toolkit. Iran will never give up that leverage. Any final deal that does not formally address Iranian control over the strait will simply mean Iran retains that card for the next crisis. Prediction 3. The Middle East is not going back to the pre-war order. The system that existed on February 27, 2026 is gone. That system was built on one assumption above all others. American military power was the ultimate guarantor of stability, and that guarantee was unconditional. That assumption has now been tested and found to be conditional. Conditional on American domestic political will. Conditional on the economic pain tolerance of American consumers. Conditional on America's ability to sustain an air campaign against an asymmetric adversary over time. Those conditions have limits, and the world now knows where those limits are. CSIS wrote this week that the ceasefire is the beginning of what they call wars after the war, not a settlement, a pause before the next cycle. And I think they are right. The question is not whether America will have to re-engage in this region. The question is whether the next engagement begins from a stronger position or a weaker one than this ceasefire left. And right now, this morning, today, the answer to that question is not reassuring. Iran's government is standing. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the man America assassinated on the first day of the 2026 war, is alive. Iran's armed forces are intact and signaling they are ready to resume. Iran has a 10-point framework sitting on the negotiating table that includes demands no American administration can accept publicly, and Iran controls the transit of oil through the strait in a way it never formally controlled before. That is the strategic reality this ceasefire produced. So when the Iranian president goes on national television and calls it a victory, and when Iran's Security Council says the ceasefire grants Iran unique geopolitical standing, and when the CFR and CSIS and NPR all publish analyses this week saying America's war objectives were not met, you have to ask yourself a very simple question. Who defined winning at the start of this war? And who is sitting closer to that definition right now? This is not prophecy. This is structural history. This may be wrong. If I am wrong, we will come back and analyze exactly why. Because the most important thing is never to simply accept what anyone tells you. The most important thing is to follow the logic, examine the evidence, and think carefully about where the structure of a situation is actually pointing. And right now, the structure is pointing somewhere that almost no one in official Washington is willing to say out loud.